One of the most significant figures in 16th century Britain was Mary Stuart, aka Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's life was one of the most fascinating of the period. Depending on which historian you consult, she was a schemer, a traitor, a pawn, or a victim. According to some, she was actually all of those things. What is certain is that Mary played a major role in the union of the Scottish and English crowns and the creation of the United Kingdom we know today. Learn more about Mary, Queen of Scots, and her incredible story on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by ButcherBox. Doing a daily podcast means spending a lot of time sitting on my computer, researching and recording. To be honest, there have been days that I've been unable to leave the house to go get something to eat, or if I do remember, it's often too late and everything is closed. This is just another reason why I love ButcherBox. They send frozen, high-quality meats and seafoods directly to my door, so I always have something that I can make in my freezer. Whether it's my famous Scotch eggs, a meatloaf, or just cooking up a steak in my cast iron frying pan, ButcherBox's home delivery makes it easy. With ButcherBox, I don't have to sacrifice quality for convenience. If you leave a busy life and are looking for good food for your family with the ease of home delivery, then you have to try ButcherBox. Sign up for ButcherBox today by going to butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY at checkout to get $30 off your first box. Again, that's butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY.
We often hear about the individuals who took the oath of office to become the chief executive. But what about the other people who play a role in each administration, or the events that may not be as well known, but that contribute to the reshaping of the office of the American presidency? On the Presidencies of the United States, we explore each administration beyond just the person holding the highest elected office in order to better understand the history that brought us to the modern-day presidency. I hope you'll join me on this journey through the annals of presidential history. Presidencies can be found anywhere fine podcasts can be found, and is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
In the aftermath of the War of the Roses in the 15th century, the Tudor dynasty rose to power with the ascension of Henry VII to the throne of England. Everyone thought that Henry VII's ascension to power finally solved the problem of succession to the English crown. While Henry did end the war, the Tudors ushered in a whole century of succession controversies. Henry VIII followed Henry VII, and he went through a series of wives in an attempt to produce an heir. In the process, he ousted the Catholic Church and established a new Protestant Church of England with him as its head. Henry VIII eventually did have a son with his third wife, Jane Seymour, Edward. When Henry VIII died, his Protestant son, Edward VI, became king at the age of 9 and was dead at the age of 15. The crown was then passed to his eldest daughter, Mary, from his first wife, the Spanish Catherine of Aragon. This Mary is not the subject of this episode, which often confuses people. Mary was Catholic, married the King of Spain, Philip II, and never had a child. So when she died in 1558, the crown passed to her younger half-sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was Protestant, and many Catholics in England didn't consider her legitimate because they didn't consider Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn as legitimate. If Elizabeth wasn't the true heir, then who should be the monarch? You'd have to go back up the ladder to Henry VII and his eldest daughter, and the older sister to Henry VIII, Margaret Tudor. She was married to King James IV of Scotland. Their son became James V of Scotland, and James V had only 2 legitimate children, James, who died before he was 1 year old, and Mary, who finally is the subject of this episode. Mary was 9 years younger and a contemporary of Elizabeth. She was born in Scotland on December 8, 1542. Just 6 days after Mary's birth, her father, James V, died, and the infant Mary became the Queen of Scotland. Her regent selected to rule until she became of age was James Hamilton, the 2nd Earl of Arran. He served in the role for 12 years. It's believed that Mary grew up speaking Scots as her first language and also learned French, the language of her mother. She did eventually learn English, but she never really wrote anything in it until later in life, and her fluency level was probably very low. In 1548, with the threat of an English invasion of Scotland looming, she was sent to the French court to be raised. Mary was well educated in the French court, learning Latin, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and her native Scots language, as well as acquiring skills in poetry, horsemanship, and music. She was noted for her beauty, grace, and intelligence, which made her a celebrated figure in the French court. In 1558, 16-year-old Mary was wed to Francis, the Dauphin of France, and was next in line to the throne. They were wed for little over a year when the King of France died and her husband became King Francis II. Mary was now 17 years old and was the Queen Monarch of Scotland as well as the Queen Consort of France. Her mother had taken over the duties of regent in 1554 and was still exercising them when Mary was married. Unfortunately, Mary's marriage and her reign as Queen of France didn't last very long. Her husband died the next year in 1560, leaving her a widow at the age of 18. In 1561, with her influence and power in France now gone due to the death of her husband, she decided to return to Scotland to take up her duties as queen. Upon her return to Scotland, Mary, who was a devout Catholic, found herself ruling a nation that had recently undergone a Protestant Reformation. Scotland's religious tensions were high, and Mary's Catholicism made her a divisive figure amongst her Protestant subjects. One of the leading Protestant figures in Scotland was John Knox. Knox hurled vitriolic invectives and insults at her from the pulpit. Knox feared that having a Catholic monarch meant that she may try to reintroduce Catholicism back to Scotland, and perhaps have a Catholic European power such as France or Spain intervene militarily. Mary, for her part, found Knox's relentless criticism intolerable. However, there was little she could do about it. In most countries, criticism of the monarch would get you arrested or killed. However, if she did that to Knox, she risked a Protestant uprising that could overthrow her monarchy. To the south in England, her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, constantly had to deal with the issue of marriage and producing an heir. And she never did end up marrying or having children. That was not the case in Scotland. In 1565, Mary became wedded to her cousin, Henry Stuart, the Lord Darnley. This marriage, while initially popular, soon became a source of scandal and conflict. Darnley was arrogant and ambitious and stylized himself as king despite only being the king consort, and his behavior alienated many of Mary's supporters. The marriage produced one son, James, but it was otherwise disastrous. On February 9, 1566, Mary's secretary, David Rizzo, an Italian, was murdered in front of her by a group of Protestant nobles, heightening the tensions between Catholics and Protestants at court. On the morning of February 10, 1567, Darnley's residence at Kirko Field in Edinburgh was destroyed by an explosion, but his body, along with that of his servant, was discovered outside of the ruins, seemingly unharmed by the blast. It appeared that Darnley had been strangled or suffocated, leading to widespread suspicion that he was murdered. The event was shrouded in intrigue and scandal, with many people believing that Mary's close associate, the Earl of Bothwell, was involved, possibly with Mary's complicity. Just 3 months after the death of Lord Darnley, Mary married the Earl of Bothwell. Given the previous rumors of their involvement in the death of Lord Darnley, this did not help their cause. Rumors had spread throughout all of Europe of Mary's involvement in the death of her husband. Even her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, warned her about it. She wrote her a letter and noted, quote, "I should ill fulfill the office of a faithful cousin or an affectionate friend if I did not tell you what all the world is thinking. Men say that instead of seizing the murderers, you are looking through your fingers while they escape, that you will not seek revenge on those who have done you so much pleasure, as though the deed would never have taken place had not the doers of it been assured impunity. For myself, I beg you to believe that I would not harbor such a thought." End quote. The marriage to Bothwell was deeply unpopular. Her Catholic subjects didn't recognize Bothwell's divorce, which allowed him to marry, as legitimate. Both Catholics and Protestants objected to her marrying the man accused of killing her ex-husband. The Scottish nobility became outraged and actively began working against their queen. 26 Scottish nobles came together to create their own army to oppose Mary and Lord Bothwell. On June 15, 1567, Mary and Bothwell's army met the nobles at Carberry Hill just east of Edinburgh. However, the Battle of Carberry Hill never happened. As negotiations took place between the two sides, almost all of Mary's army deserted her, abandoning her on the battlefield. Mary was captured by the Scottish nobles and taken to the Loch Leven Castle north of Edinburgh, where she was held in captivity. During her captivity, she had a miscarriage, and finally on July 24th, she abdicated the Scottish crown in favor of her infant son, who now became James VI of Scotland. Her husband, the Earl of Bothwell, was allowed to leave. He subsequently fled to Norway and was taken captive in Denmark. He was put in prison, where he died in 1578, 11 years after fleeing Scotland. After he left Scotland, he never saw his wife again. She never saw her son again, as he was to be raised by Protestant nobles, in particular her illegitimate half-brother James Stuart, the first Earl of Moray. She was held at Loch Leven for 10 months. Then on May 2, 1568, she escaped with the help of the brother of the owner of the castle. She managed to raise an army of 6,000 men and met her half-brother at the Battle of Langside. Mary lost the battle, and then fled south into England, where she thought that her cousin Elizabeth would help her. On the one hand, Elizabeth did want to help her cousin, who was a duly anointed queen. On the other hand, Mary was a threat to Elizabeth, as she was a rallying point for all of the Catholics in England. The Scottish regent James Stuart presented to Elizabeth a box of letters that were supposedly written by Mary to her husband. Known as the Casket Letters, they were a series of 8 controversial documents, including love letters, sonnets, and other papers. These letters were reportedly found in a silver casket in June of 1567, after Bothwell fled following the defeat of his forces by the Scottish nobles. The contents of the letters seem to suggest that Mary was not only involved in a romantic relationship with Bothwell, but also complicit in the plot to murder her husband, Lord Darnley. Mary was put on trial in absentia in York for the murder of Lord Darnley, but Mary didn't recognize their right to put her on trial. Elizabeth didn't want to find her cousin and another queen guilty of murder, so she just put Mary away. And it should be noted that there have been serious debate amongst historians as to the authenticity of the Casket Letters. Mary was held as a captive of Elizabeth for the next 19 years. She was only 25 years old when her captivity in England began. Over the years, she was moved from castle to castle, and Elizabeth's ministers kept a close eye on all of her visitors and correspondence. During the time, she became the focus of numerous Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Although she denied involvement in these plots, her association with them ultimately led to her downfall. In 1586, Mary was implicated in the Babington Plot, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. Despite her protests of innocence, Mary was tried and found guilty of treason. Elizabeth was reluctant to sign Mary's death warrant, but eventually did so under pressure from her advisors. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. She faced her death with dignity, dressed in red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. As with the Casket Letters, there has been a great deal of debate as to if Mary was actually involved with the plots against Elizabeth, or if Elizabeth's advisors set her up to get rid of her and remove a potential threat to her power. Either way, Mary, Queen of Scotland and France, was dead. Elizabeth lived for another 16 years after Mary's death. When she died in 1603 without any heirs, the English crown passed to Mary's son. James VI of Scotland was now also James I of England. After centuries of division and conflict, the thrones of England and Scotland were now united, and has remained united to the present day. Mary, Queen of Scots, played an important role in the history of 16th century Britain. Some historians consider her a villain, and some consider her a victim. Either way, she played a pivotal part in the creation of the modern British monarchy. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Benji Long and Cameron Kieffer. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon, including the show's producers. Your support helps me put out a show every single day. And also, Patreon is currently the only place where Everything Everywhere Daily merchandise is available to the top tier of supporters. If you'd like to talk to other listeners of the show and members of the Completionist Club, you can join the Everything Everywhere Daily Facebook group or Discord server. Links to everything are in the show notes.